Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the conversion of the house of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, which we saw was narrated in a manner similar to Saul's blindness and its cure after his revelation on the Damascus road. After the house of Cornelius is baptized and received the Holy Spirit, the account closed with Peter returning to Jerusalem to explain to the leaders and the gathered members of the community there the beginning of the mission to the Gentiles. We now turn to the aftermath of the events that have occupied our attention in the past few sessions: the death of Stephen, the experience of Saul on the Damascus road, and the conversion of the house of Cornelius. We discover at this time that the direction of the early Christian community is coming more from Antioch in Syria than from Jerusalem. Thus, we begin this session with a description of the church at Antioch. This leads to Barnabas, who has been sent to the community at Antioch, searching out Saul in his hometown of Tarsus. Just as with the ministry of Jesus, success leads to opposition from authorities. So Herod Agrippa I, the ruler of the area, began a persecution of those who belonged to the church. This led to Peter being apprehended, arrested, imprisoned, and miraculously escaping. Upon escape, he heads for the house of John Mark, where he encounters the housemaid Rhoda. Our session will end with an account of the end of Herod Agrippa I. The narrative now continues, looking at the ministry of those scattered as a result of the death of Stephen, which we heard in Acts 8:1-4. This strand in the overall narrative was broken up by the narratives of Saul and the house of Cornelius. Because of this persecution, the message spread well beyond the boundaries of Israel, to Phoenicia and Antioch to the north and Cyprus to the west. Johnson notes that at this time, Joppa could be considered a part of Phoenicia, and according to Josephus, Caesarea was within the Phoenician territory. So Philip and Peter, in their missionary activity, have ventured into Phoenician territory. The addition of Cyprus and Antioch show that these scattered missioners went even further than Peter and Philip. Cyrus is an island in the Mediterranean to the west of Israel, and Antioch is a major city of Syria to the north, located on the Orontes River. It was seen reckoned as the third most important city in the Roman Empire after Rome and Alexandria. It was noted also for its large Jewish population. Luke notes that in this missionary thrust, they preached only to Jews, contra to Peter and Philip. But a group of them, who did move beyond the Jews, preaching the good news to Greeks in Antioch, particularly they preached to the men of Cyprus and Cyrene. Here is a map that gives us a sense of the location of Antioch on the Orontes. As you can see from the smaller map on the right, it's located between the Roman provinces of Cilicia, modern southern Turkey, and Syria. It is the modern city of Antakya in the south of central Turkey. The larger map on the left gives us a closer view of the city. Note that the Orontes River flows through the northern section. You can see that it's a typical Greco-Roman city with agora, forum, theater, amphitheater, and circus. This is what Antakya in Turkey looks like today. Here we see a bridge over the Orontes River. One of the key sites is the Church of St. Peter in Antioch, which is really a hollowed out cave which has been made into a church. This picture was taken about 12 years ago. Since that time, the church or cave has been declared unsafe for visitors and prohibiting the visitors from entering it. Inside the cave is a stone chair known as the chair of St. Peter at Antioch, pictured here. Here is a view of the other caves in the vicinity of St. Peter's Church. As you look out from the front of St. Peter's Church, one can see the modern city of Antakya before them. This would be considerably larger than the city of Paul's day. The narrative continues, noting that these missionaries had great success, the reason being that the hand of the Lord was with them. Recall the Old Testament. The hand of the Lord was a sign of the Lord's power. Thus, the power of the divine was with these missionaries to, as Johnson puts it, validate their testimony. The result was that many believed, that is, they turned to the Lord. Such success could not go without being brought to the attention of the Mother Church, and was a result of Barnabas being sent to investigate what was happening in Antioch. Upon his arrival in Antioch, Barnabas saw the grace of God at work, and so he exhorted the community to remain loyal, that is, devoted with firm purpose of heart. Thus we see the church in Antioch enjoys the same favor as the mother church in Jerusalem. Then we get a simple description of Barnabas, whom we have seen now on several occasions in the narrative. He's described as a good man, committed to the faith, full of the Spirit and of faith. This would be a significant reason to qualify him for the mission he is now on. As we saw in 4:36 to 37, Barnabas has been one who was consistently obedient to the apostles in Jerusalem. Now, having completed his mission in Antioch, Barnabas then heads toward Tarsus, where Paul has been sent after his disputes with the Hellenists following his experience on the Damascus Road. His intent is to bring the story of Saul's acceptance of the faith to completion. Some manuscripts of Acts 11:25 to 26 have an expansion of the text regarding this search of Barnabas for Saul. It says, "He heard that Saul was in Tarsus. He went to find him. And when he found him, he exhorted him to come to Antioch. And when they came, for a whole year, a considerable crowd was stirred up. Then, for the first time, the disciples were called Christians." You notice that when Paul joins Barnabas in teaching and preaching, it's similar to the work of the 12 in Jerusalem. Kurtz notes that what we have here is a growth in stages of the early church. First, those scattered after Stephen's martyrdom converted many Greeks. Then Barnabas came to check it out and converted a significantly greater number. And finally, Paul and Barnabas together catechize even more converts. The final point to note that in Antioch it was, for the first time, this fledgling church was referred to by the term Christian, that is, a follower of Jesus Christ. The term, which parallels such terms as Herodian, a follower of Herod, was imposed on the community with a somewhat negative sense. They were Messianists. But as time went on, they came to be satisfied with the term, and it took on a positive sense. Next, we're told that the prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch, continuing the communication between the mother and daughter church, as Kurtz puts it. One of them is named Agabus, who foretold through the Holy Spirit that there would be a great famine throughout the world. This same Agabus will resurface in Acts 21:10 to 14. There is then an aside by the author that this famine took place in the days of Claudius, that is, the Roman Emperor Claudius. to give credence to that aside, the historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, Suetonius a Roman and Josephus a Jew, note that an extensive famine occurred during the reign of Claudius. This famine leads to the daughter churches, especially Antioch here, to send relief to the mother church in Judea. The relief took the form of what they could afford. This was the beginning of what would become the collection for the Jerusalem church, which will be referred to many times in the missionary work of Paul. Further, this aid or relief was sent to the elders of the Jerusalem church by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. Two further notes on the collection for the mother church that has just been introduced. The fixed, determined, or assigned amount comes from the verb horizo, a verb derived from the noun horos, meaning boundary. That is, they set a boundary on what they would donate based upon what each could afford. This is seen to be parallel to a common sharing of goods within the community that we saw in chapter 4. That sharing was as each had need. The purpose of this fixing, assigning, or setting would be to serve or be of service to the mother church. The word for service is diakonia, the very word used for the ministry of the apostles and others in the early community. Thus, this collection comes from what one could afford and was to be of service to the mother church. The second point to be noted is that in the listing of those who would bear the collection to the Jerusalem community, Barnabas is listed first. Due to his position in Acts, one might expect that Paul might be given top billing. The reality is, at this point in the narrative, Barnabas seems to be the key figure. As Paul rises in stature, he will be given the position at the beginning. Particularly, we'll see that in chapter 13, verse 43. The narrative now turns back to Jerusalem and to yet another persecution of the community there. This time, King Herod, particularly Herod Agrippa I, institutes a rather virulent attack on the community, and many are killed or scattered. The family is listed at the top. His son, Antipater II, then has 5 sons, of whom Herod, surnamed the Great, was the most significant. He, Herod the Great, then becomes the father of many children by several wives. Of interest here are the children by the wife Mariamna the Hasmonean, especially their son Aristobulus IV, who became the father of Herod Agrippa I, who was the Herod of significance in the narrative that we're now looking at. The genealogy is laid out in a simpler form in this diagram. You'll notice 3 other sons of Herod the Great to the right of the diagram: Herod Philip, Herod Antipas, and Archelaus. These are the 3 whom Luke notes succeed Herod the Great, along with Lysimachus, who become the 4 tetrarchs at the time of Jesus. See Luke 3, 1-2. The narrative of Herod's persecution is set around the same time as the Agabus prophecy, as signified by the connective about that time. Herod is said to have put his hand to doing harm to some who, quote, belong to the church, unquote. Then an example of the harm that he inflicted is given. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. This would be James, the son of Zebedee, who was one of the first to become a follower of Jesus. As the ensuing narrative will show, there is no move to replace him, as there was with Judas, as he is presumably thought to have, upon his death, gone to take his throne in heaven, as was prophesied in Luke 23:20. The action pleased the Jews, and it gave Herod impetus to continue. He proceeded then to arrest Peter during the days of unleavened bread, following the Passover. Thus Peter follows in the footsteps of Jesus, who was arrested in the same season. Agrippa's soldiers seized Peter, and they put him in jail with a rather large guard, 4 squads around him. The Greek term tetradion implies a squad of 4 soldiers. Herod employed 4 of those tetradia, that is 16 soldiers for 1 man. His intent was to bring him before the people after the Passover celebrations. This was different from Jesus, who was stealthily tried and executed during the feast itself. So, during the feast, Peter was kept in jail, but the church, the gathered community in Jerusalem, never ceased fervent prayer on his behalf. Thus, the groundwork has been laid for the events that follow. The prayers of the church will be answered. The scene shifts to the jail where Peter's being held. The time is the night before the hearing, in which Herod was about to arraign him. Peter is under heavy guard. He sleeps with a soldier on either side of him. He's bound with chains, and 2 further guards were standing at the door of the cell. In all, there are 4 soldiers on duty over Peter at any given moment. In other words, there's no way that he can possibly escape. Or is there? With the typical "and behold," kai idou in Greek, Luke tells us that someone has been able to penetrate the security. An angel of the Lord stood next to Peter, and a light shone in the cell. The impression is that the angel suddenly appears out of nowhere. The angel striking Peter on the side awakens him, that is, causes him to rise up, using the verb egero, which has connotations of the resurrection. He then uses the other word connected with the resurrection, anhistemi, saying to Peter, anasta, that is, stand up, and take, that is, quickly. No sooner had the angel spoken than the chains fell from Peter's hands. The angel further commands that with his freed hand he is now to fasten his belt and put on his sandals and throw on his cloak and follow the angel. Peter, more than likely still in the process of waking up, rises and follows the angel. Many feel that Peter did not realize the gravity or the reality of what he was experiencing. Luke notes that Peter thought that he was seeing a vision. But as Peter continued after the angel, the reality of the situation slowly was impressed upon him. They passed through the first guard post, and then the second, only to be confronted by the great gate, the great iron gate, leading from the prison into the city. Upon their arrival at the gate, it opens spontaneously, automate in Greek, from which we get our English word automatic. Peter, following the angel, is thus able to pass through all the security obstacles unimpeded. Once they're out in the street, and they head down the street away from the prison, the angel departs from Peter. Left in the street by himself, Luke tells us that Peter came to himself and realized that the angelic companion was from the Lord to rescue Peter from Herod and the expectations of the Jews for Peter's demise. Kurtz summarizes, the community had fervently prayed for Peter's release, just as Jesus had prayed so fervently as he was suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. There are overtones of the miraculous release of the Israelites from Pharaoh in the Exodus here also. This prefigured Jesus making possible our release from sin through his death and resurrection. Thus, Peter's release from prison is an image of God's rescue of all his people from the power of sin, Satan, and death. Finally, realizing what has happened, Peter goes to the only place he knows would be safe, the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Note the double name John, which has a Hebraic ring to it, Yohanan, the grace of God, and Mark, which has a distinct Greek ring to it. As we've mentioned before, several of the key characters in the New Testament narrative have this double name: Simon Peter, Saul Paul, Silas Silvanus, etc. This is where the community gathered. It's where they began and continued their prayers for the safety and release of Peter. Peter arrives at the house and knocks at the door of the gateway. His knock is immediately answered by one of the women servants, whose name is given as Rhoda. Johnson reminds us that this is reminiscent of another encounter with a woman servant in a courtyard, the courtyard of the high priest's house, where Peter had denied Jesus. That recollection impresses us with the fact that even though Peter denied, God never turned on Peter. Here, in Peter's moment of dire need, God assists him, bringing him to yet another woman servant in another courtyard. God does not abandon Peter, and God does not abandon us, even though many times we have let God down. Rhoda recognizes the voice of Peter, but rather than opening the door, she in joy runs to those gathered in the community to announce that their prayers have been answered. Peter's standing at the gate, frantically knocking at the door by now. The community refuses to believe, telling Rhoda that she's crazy, out of her mind, raving mad. She holds her ground, insisting that she saw Peter standing at the door. They claim it must have been an angel. It could not be him. And seemingly a rather lengthy discussion ensues as to whether it was or it wasn't Peter. Leaving Peter at the gate, knocking for someone to let him in. All the commotion could certainly have tipped off the authorities as to where Peter had gone after his escape. All the more reason to get the door open and let him in. Finally, the door is opened and all see Peter. They're amazed. They're astonished. We could translate this as they were beside themselves. Existemi, the verb, is again composed of two Greek words. Ex, a preposition, meaning outside, beside, or from, and histemi, a verb meaning to stand. Thus, they were standing beside themselves. Peter finally motions to the amazed community to calm down, to be silent. And he tells them the whole story of how the Lord brought him from the prison to this house. Finally, he told them to tell James and the brothers about his miraculous escape. This James is known as the brother of the Lord. He is the head of the Jerusalem community and will arise as the chief spokesperson in the Apostolic Council of chapter 15. He is also possibly the author of the letter of James. The unit closes with Peter departing from the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, and possibly even the city of Jerusalem, in order to get away from Herod. The community did not know where he was going, and given the ruthlessness of Herod, it was probably better for them that way. We're simply told that he goes to another place. This marks the beginning of the switch in Acts from Peter as the major character in Acts to Paul as the major character. Upon his departure from Jerusalem, Peter left James in charge of the community there. Having described what occurred with Peter after the miraculous escape, the Acts turns to the fate of the guards who were to keep Peter in custody. The next day, as news of the events of the preceding evening got around among the soldiers, there was no little disturbance among them. The negative here is a figure of speech known as litotes, which is an understatement. No little disturbance implies that there was a rather significant disturbance among the soldiers. And this disturbance concerned what happened to Peter, that is, his escape. How could it have happened, and what will happen now as a result? Herod, more than likely furious over the events, has his soldiers search for Peter, but he's unable to locate him. His next move is to interrogate the guards. The Greek word here implies a juridical cross-examination. They're clearly in hot water. And not getting any satisfaction from the guards, he orders that they should be taken away, more than likely for execution. Seeing that he can get no further in Jerusalem, Herod departs and returns to his residence in Caesarea and spent some time there. But Caesarea will not bring any peace to Herod either. Another group who had riled him, here the Greek word implies being angry to the point of fighting openly, appears in Caesarea. The Tyrians and the Sidonians, that is, representatives of the citizens of Tyre and Sidon, which cities were adjacent to Herod's territory, and they were in dispute with him. They came to present their case, being of one accord, that is, together. Homothumedos, that very word that we saw has described the unity of the early Christian community throughout the Acts. They managed to persuade one of Herod's chamberlains, Blastus, to allow them time with Herod to present their plea for peace, as they depended on food from Galilee all the way from the time of Solomon. A dispute with Herod could put such dependence in jeopardy. Hence, a request for peace. This is a map that shows Herod's movements from Caesarea to Joppa, and from there to Jerusalem and back again. This area is the site for many of the events narrated in these chapters of Acts. Now, apparently, Blastus was successful in securing an audience with the people of Tyre and Herod. On the appointed day, Herod arrayed himself in his royal robes and took his place on the throne. This would be the official judgment seat of the governor, known in Greek as the bema. From this seat, he addresses the assembled Tyrians and Sidonians in a speech. The crowd, in desperation, shouts out something that is meant to flatter Herod. Quote, "It's the voice of a god and not a human." Josephus, in his account of the events, note that they, the people, seeing his splendid garments in the bright sunlight, responded in fear and awe, as if to a god. Now Herod accepts the people's accolades and fails to ascribe the glory and honor that the people were heaping on him to God. He basked in their flattery rather than rejecting it. He essentially commits blasphemy, accepting for himself what is to be ascribed to God. As a result, an angel of the Lord struck him down. The verb which is used in the preceding to describe the angel's actions toward Peter to wake him up now has a more ominous connotation of divine retribution. The result of that act is then described. He, Herod, was eaten by worms and breathed his last. Kurtz notes that this is reminiscent of the punishment of the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28:2-10, when he had pretensions to the divine glory, saying, "I am a god. I sit in the seat of the gods." Several authors note that this death, being eaten by worms, is very similar to another tyrant's death, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who through his tyrannical actions incited the Maccabean revolt. After describing a rather gruesome end to Herod, the author of Acts brings this section of the story to an end, noting that the word of God grew and increased, despite attempts of many like Herod to block it. The movement that began in chapter 2 has continually grown and spread, and it will continue to do so throughout Acts. With the completion of the unit about Peter's miraculous escape from prison, we turn again to Barnabas and Saul, whom we left traveling to Jerusalem with the aid collected for the Jerusalem church. Now they're returning to Antioch, having completed their mission in Jerusalem. One further detail is mentioned. They bring with them John Mark. Remember, Peter, after escaping from prison, went to the home of the mother of John Mark. Thus, the stage is set for the next movement of the Acts, which begins with the first missionary journey of Paul. Well, that's about all the time we have in this session. In our next session, we'll look at the community of Antioch and trace the first missionary journey of Paul, which will begin in that great city. See you then.